Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I read the history of the dead. That's taphonomy, the science of what happens to organisms after they die, how they decay and get buried and mineralize over time and either disappear into the geological record or survive in it. My specific work is forensic taphonomy, which means I look at remains and I tell people what happened to them, how old they are, what conditions they were preserved in, how they ended up where they were found, and what the physical evidence of the bones themselves can tell you about the organism they came from. I've been doing this for 15 years as an independent consultant, working for universities, law enforcement agencies, archaeological teams, anyone who needs someone to read a set of remains carefully and report what the reading shows. My name is Sloane Mercer. I'm 40 years old and I work out of a converted garage behind my house in northern New Mexico that I've spent a decade outfitting as a proper examination and analysis laboratory. I have a good microscope setup, a decent XRF analyzer for compositional work, a fume hood, proper specimen storage. It's not a university lab, but it's mine, and it's well equipped for what I do. What I do requires knowing bone, not just knowing about it in the academic sense, but knowing it the way a craftsperson knows their material, in your hands, through your fingers, through the physical intelligence you build up over thousands of specimens examined across 15 years. I've handled remains from every major vertebrate group and a significant range of invertebrates. I know what bone looks like and feels like and what it tells you when you hold it and turn it in the light and run your calipers along it. 6 weeks ago, a specimen case arrived at my door that I'm still working out how to understand. The commission came through the institutional contact for an archaeological survey team excavating a site in the high desert of eastern Utah, a multi-season project focused on late Cretaceous formations in the region. The team's site geologist had flagged some specimens recovered during routine excavation as anomalous and recommended they be assessed by a specialist before any formal identification was attempted. My name came up through a referral chain I've been part of for years. The institutional contact sent me a brief description, unusual fossilized material recovered from a formation horizon that didn't align with the expected stratigraphy, and asked if I'd take the assessment. I said yes. Anomalous specimens are the interesting ones. The case arrived on a Tuesday. 17 individual specimens, wrapped in archival foam, each labeled with excavation coordinates and recovery depth. I logged them in and photographed each one before I touched anything, which is standard protocol. And then I sat down at my examination table and opened the first specimen bag. I want to describe what happened in the next few minutes carefully, because it's the part of this that I keep coming back to. Not the analysis results, not the dating, not any of what came later. Just those first few minutes of holding the specimens and looking at them. They were bones. I knew that immediately, and I knew it with the certainty that 15 years of handling skeletal material gives you mineralized, fossilized, the weight and density of genuine biological material that had gone through a real taphonomic preservation process, not a geological formation that resembled bone. not a hoax. Bone, the real thing. But wrong. I don't mean slightly unusual or outside the normal range of variation. I mean that the cortical architecture of the material, the internal structural arrangement of the bone tissue visible in the fractured surface of the largest specimen, was arranged differently from any skeletal element I'd examined before. The geometry of the cross-section implied load-bearing in a direction that no terrestrial body plan uses. Not an unfamiliar direction in the abstract, just a direction that the biomechanical requirements of life on Earth have never produced, because the forces that would require that geometry don't exist in our gravity and atmosphere in the way this bone was built to resist them. I put it down. I picked it up again. I spent the rest of that day just looking, turning each specimen in my hands, running my calipers over the surfaces, measuring every dimension I could measure, building a physical map of what I was holding before I reached for any interpretive framework. I do this with every unusual specimen because the hands know things the brain hasn't caught up with yet, and I have learned to let the physical understanding develop before I start trying to classify. By the end of the first day, I knew the bones were real, and I didn't have a category for them. I ran my standard analytical battery over the following week. Histological sections. First, I cut thin sections from 2 of the smaller specimens and examined the bone microstructure under the microscope. The tissue showed genuine biological organization, growth structures consistent with a living organism that had built and maintained skeletal material over time, not the crystal structure of a geological formation, the organized, purposeful architecture of material that a biology had produced. The organization was unlike anything in my reference collection. I have microscope slides from over 200 species in my reference files going back to my graduate work. Mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, some invertebrates. The bone microstructure of terrestrial and aquatic animals has a range of variation, but it follows rules, common underlying principles of biological construction that reflect the shared evolutionary history of everything alive today. Even very distantly related organisms, a whale and a lizard, show histological features that connect them to the same deep ancestry. The histology of these specimens didn't connect to that ancestry. It was biological. It had the organized complexity of living produced material. But the organizational logic was different from anything in my reference slides in a fundamental way, as if the biology that produced it had arrived at skeletal tissue by a different developmental route, following different rules, building from different first principles. I ran isotopic analysis next. Carbon and oxygen isotopes for environmental context, uranium-lead dating on the mineral matrix for age. The environmental isotopes told me the organism had lived in conditions I couldn't precisely characterize because the signatures didn't match any paleo-environmental context in my reference literature. The dating result I ran 3 times. The formation the specimens came from was Precambrian. The bones were from a time before the Cambrian explosion, the evolutionary event, roughly 540 million years ago, that produced the first complex animal body plans in the fossil record. The first bones in the fossil record, the first mineralized skeletal elements produced by complex animals, appeared in the Cambrian. These specimens predated that. I had bones from before bones existed. I sat with that for a long time. I emailed Dr. Fen Marsh on a Thursday evening. Fen is a vertebrate paleontologist at a natural history museum in Denver, who I've consulted with before on unusual specimens. He's 30 years in the field, careful and precise, not given to excited reactions to ambiguous material. The kind of scientist who has seen enough unusual things over a long career that it takes something genuine to shift his register. I sent him high-resolution scans of all 17 specimens with the full measurement data and the dating result attached. I wrote a brief cover note saying I had an unusual commission I'd value his assessment on, and left it at that. He normally takes several days to respond to consultation requests. He responded in 4 hours and asked if he could call. I gave him my number and he called within 10 minutes of my reply. The first thing he asked was whether I'd confirmed the dating result. I told him I'd run it 3 times with 2 different methods, and the results were consistent. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me to confirm it again verbally, which I did, and he was quiet again. He said he'd been going through the scans since my email arrived. He said the skeletal geometry in the specimens didn't correspond to any body plan in the fossil record. Not any. He'd been in vertebrate paleontology for 30 years, and he had access to one of the better reference collections in the country, and the architecture of these specimens had no analogue in the entire documented history of complex life on Earth. I asked him if he thought they could be an undiscovered lineage, something that had existed in the Precambrian and left no other trace. He said undiscovered lineage implied a connection to the tree of life that produces the organisms we know, that what he was seeing in the scans didn't look like a branch of that tree. It looked like a different tree. He said it carefully, and I heard what it cost him to say it. 30 years of professional framework being set aside to say a thing that the framework didn't have a place for. We agreed I'd continue the physical analysis and share everything as it developed. After we hung up, I sat in my lab for a long time with the specimens on the table in front of me. I spent the following 2 weeks working out the body plan. 17 specimens is a meaningful sample. Not enough for certainty, but enough for a reasoned reconstruction if you're systematic about it. I approached it the way I approach every reconstruction, starting with the most structurally informative elements and working outward from there, building up the architecture of the organism the way the evidence supports it, rather than the way I expected it to look. What I produce doesn't look like anything. I want to be precise about that. Not that it's unrecognizable as biology. The body plan is internally consistent, follows its own clear logic, shows the coherent organization of a genuine functional anatomy. Whatever this organism was, it worked. Its biology was real, and it operated by rules that were consistent within themselves. The rules just had nothing to do with the rules that produced everything else. The skeletal architecture implied a body plan oriented around a different primary axis than terrestrial animals use. The load-bearing geometry I'd noticed on the first day was part of a larger structural system, a whole-body framework built around mechanical relationships that don't exist in terrestrial biomechanics because the forces that would require them aren't present in the environment that shaped life on Earth. The organism wasn't adapted to our gravity in the way that terrestrial animals are adapted to our gravity. It was adapted to something, but not to this. I built the reconstruction carefully, checking each element against the others for consistency, revising when the geometry didn't resolve cleanly. The final model took 11 days and 3 major revisions. When I had it, I looked at it for a long time without writing anything. Then I called Fen. He looked at the reconstruction files while we were on the phone. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said it was the most significant thing he'd seen in 30 years, and he needed to think about how to characterize it, and he'd call me back. He called back the next day. I'd been putting off the size calculation, not deliberately. I told myself I was waiting until the reconstruction was solid enough to use as a basis for the proportional estimates. That was true. It was also true that I had looked at the cortical thickness measurements and the structural geometry, and I had a rough, intuitive sense of where the size calculation was going to land, and I wasn't in a hurry to make it precise. I ran it properly once the reconstruction was finished. Cortical thickness correlates with body mass in predictable ways across skeletal types. The structural geometry of the load-bearing elements constrains the size range further. I had enough data for a reasonable estimate with error bars I was comfortable with. The organism was large, not incomprehensibly large, not outside the range of biology, but large enough that an organism of this size, with a skeleton of this architecture, should have left a significant trace in the fossil record if its lineage had continued. Something this size doesn't disappear cleanly from the record. It leaves bones, and its descendants leave bones, and the line of evidence persists across geological time in ways that paleontologists find. There was no line of evidence, no subsequent record of anything resembling this body plan anywhere in the 540 million years of fossil record following the formation these specimens came from. I raised this with Fen. He said he'd been thinking about the same thing. He said the only explanation he could construct was that the lineage hadn't continued, that what I had found was physical evidence of a biology that had existed before the Cambrian and hadn't survived into it. He said the timing was specific enough to matter. The Cambrian explosion was the most significant event in the history of life on Earth. The sudden appearance in the geological record of virtually every major animal body plan, arriving in geological terms almost simultaneously. Before the Cambrian, the fossil record was sparse, and the life forms it documented were mostly microbial. After the Cambrian, the world was full of complex animals. He said whatever I was looking at was from before, and it hadn't made it to after. I asked him why. He said he thought the honest answer was that he didn't know and probably couldn't know from the available evidence. But he said there was a question adjacent to the one I was asking that he'd been sitting with since I sent him the reconstruction. He said the Cambrian explosion had always raised a question in paleontology about what preceded it. The speed of it in geological terms was difficult to account for through gradual evolutionary processes alone. The suddenness of it, every major body plan appearing in a geologically brief window. He said he'd always thought of it as a beginning. He said he was having trouble thinking of it that way now. I asked him what he meant. He said the word he kept coming back to was replaced. We left it there. I finished my formal report and submitted it to the archaeological team's institutional contact 2 weeks ago. The report documents everything accurately: the specimen descriptions, the histological findings, the isotopic results, the dating, the body plan reconstruction, the size estimate, all of it precisely stated in professional language. I attributed the anomalous body plan to an unknown Precambrian organism representing a previously undescribed biological lineage, and recommended the specimens be submitted for additional analysis by specialists in Precambrian paleobiology. I kept complete copies of everything: all the scan files, all the measurement data, all the analytical results, all my field notes and reconstruction working documents. I kept them because the work required it and because I wanted them. I still have the physical specimens. The institutional contact hasn't arranged their transfer yet, and they're sitting in my storage unit under proper archival conditions, temperature and humidity controlled, documented per my handling protocols. I check the storage conditions twice a day as required. I look at them when I check. I haven't stopped looking at them since they arrived. I think about the Cambrian explosion. I've been reading about it since Fenn used the word replaced. Going through the literature in a way I haven't read anything since graduate school, trying to understand the event from every angle the science offers. The paleontological literature describes it as the diversification of complex animal life, the appearance of new body plans, the beginning of the animal-dominated world the planet has had ever since. What the literature doesn't dwell on is what it ended. The Precambrian had its own life, not just microbial mats and simple organisms. The Ediacaran fauna, strange soft-bodied organisms that filled the oceans before the Cambrian, with body plans that were discontinued at the boundary, that don't connect to any of the animal lineages that came after. They were there, and then they weren't, and the world after the Cambrian was a different world, built on different biology. The specimens on my shelf are older than the Ediacaran fauna. Whatever produced them was here before the organisms that preceded the animals that preceded us. It was here in the deep Precambrian, and it had bones, which means it had a biology complex enough to produce mineralized skeletal tissue long before any other organism on this planet did. And then it was gone, and the biology that followed it produced everything alive today, including the person sitting in her lab writing this. I think about what replaced means in that context. I don't think it means the same thing as ended or outlasted or outcompeted. Those words describe processes that leave the replaced thing intact as a fossil lineage, as evidence of what was there before. The Ediacaran fauna are in the record. The replaced thing leaves traces. Whatever produced the bones on my shelf left 17 specimens in one formation in the high desert of Utah. For something this size, with a biology this structured and this apparently successful, that's not a trace. That's almost nothing. That's the kind of record you get when something was very thoroughly cleared away, and a very small number of specimens happened to survive in the particular conditions that preserved them. I think about the Cambrian explosion and the speed of it, and the completeness of it, and all of the new body plans appearing fully formed in geological terms. And I think about what those new body plans replaced and what replacement really means when it happens that fast and that completely. I don't finish that thought all the way to the end. I check the storage conditions. The specimens are where I left them, mineralized and ancient and real, the physical evidence of a biology that followed different rules in a world that no longer exists, sitting in archival foam in a temperature-controlled cabinet in my converted garage in northern New Mexico. I close the cabinet. I go back to my desk. Fen emails occasionally. We've been careful about what we put in writing, which is its own kind of communication between two people who understand the same thing and have agreed not to say it out loud yet. His emails discuss the reconstruction, the histology, the analytical results. They're professional and precise, and they don't use the word replaced again. I think about it anyway. I think about what was here before us and what happened to it and what arrived after it was gone, and I think about the bones on my shelf, and I think about the word that Fen said and then stopped saying. The specimens are real. I've held them in my hands. I've run my calipers along the cortical surfaces and looked at the microstructure under the microscope and read the isotopes and built the reconstruction from 17 pieces of something that existed before the world was the world it is now. It was here first. It didn't make it to after. The bones don't tell me why. They just tell me it was here and that it wasn't the only thing.